All right, here we have education and work. We have a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois that says, "Education must not simply teach work, it must teach life." I firmly believe that education is liberation. A proper education can liberate the mind so that you are not able to be oppressed, not able to be told lies from governments and societies, right, that want to control you and believe the propaganda. A proper education should be able to help you critically think. And then, if you are able to critically think, you should be able to structure your life accordingly to whatever it is that you desire. So, I think education is liberation, and to attack education is an act of oppression. Education plays such an important role in our individual lives, and as we grow up and develop, it shapes us into functioning members of society. And so, some people would say education also brainwashes you into becoming a tax-paying citizen. But in truth, it gives you the skill sets you are going to use in life. So, if you do not have a proper education, you will have a more struggle in later in life. It has been linked, the opportunities that you have in life and success have been linked all the way back to a proper preschool, all the way on through higher education system. So if the education system is not equitable nor effective in serving African American students, then this results in the equity gaps that we see in lower performing students and higher dropout rates as compared to their peers. However, these things are fixable and they are able to change with the proper resources. And so it is makes one ask, why aren't the resources being spent in this way? And perhaps is this problem related to systemic racism in the United States, right? All right. Next up here, we have an acknowledgement that inequality in the educational system in this country does start in preschool. There's a little NPR clip where they're talking about bias even in preschool and preschool teachers. And it's really unfortunate because at the most youngest ages, education can be such a positive experience, and students who really enjoy education want to continue, versus students who do not favor education as a positive experience, do not see the value in it, and you cannot teach kids that do not see the value in education. So that's going to have consequences. So we're going to ask questions in this lecture a little bit. And so the first one here is, are African Americans increasing or decreasing in terms of educational attainment? African Americans have been shown to increase in educational attainment since 1940s. Basically, at the time of slavery, it was illegal. You could be put to death if you were caught reading. So, as I already stated, why would that be the case? Because the powers that be, being the white males who owned slaves, wanted to maintain control, wanted to not allow slaves to think that they could put together a plan to escape, to think critically, to realize there were other alternatives. They wanted them pigeonholed by their ignorance or lack of education. So, when slavery was ended and black people were able or allowed eventually to get into higher education in the HBCUs, as we still had segregated education at the time, they were able to recognize the importance of having access to education in order to free themselves, free their mind, free their fellow comrades. So, have we been increasing educational attainment? Well, absolutely, because during the time of slavery, we had zero, quote unquote, zero educational attainment. So from there to now, we have increased a lot, I would say. Now, do we see trends where things are traveling downwards, like quality of education? Yes. Or where we see higher rates of dropouts and things like that? Yes. But what I will say is that statistics have shown that we are even doing better in those areas than previous years. So we've been increasing in math scores, increasing in English scores, increasing in AP exams, and increasing in high school graduation. So yes, we do see examples where dropout rates are higher, where schools aren't properly funded, where problems exist way before high school graduation, right? Problems exist in school systems at much younger ages, and we see a drop off of interest and conduct issues with some students. But we also see plenty of examples of where schools are properly funded from pre K up to high school, and we see examples where all students are accepted into higher education from that high school, right? So there are plenty of examples where a proper education does provide opportunities for success for our Black kids. Another question: are more African American women or men completing their education? Well, as it stands, women are more likely to complete, and women are more likely to hold degrees as compared to Black men. So let's take that into consideration. When back in the day, women were not allowed to go to school either, and they fought for rights to do that. And so you had an era where, you know, it was the first woman to attend an all-male school or an all-male major, right? And they had to break barriers of being a woman and of being Black. And have they done that? Absolutely. So we do see more African American females than men holding degrees. It is said that statistically that Black women hold more degrees of anybody, more higher education degrees. We tend to move on and get another higher degree thinking it's going to give us access to things, and we can talk more about that later. Educational attainment and degree attainment does generally provide access to higher paying jobs and therefore more stability throughout life. So historically, basically for what year was it, 1831, the Nat Turner Rebellion happened in 1831, and he led the rebellion to free the slaves. And there were two philosophers who thought that they had the best idea on how the Black community could move forward and become successful. To these two people were Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington, overall, he had an idea about how to generate economical progress, right? And a way for upward mobility to come out of the caste system of slavery through producing products, using your labor, etc., and then using the money to propel yourself forward to become educated. W.E.B. Du Bois was born free. He stated that all should be educated, but we should also focus on the top 10%. He called it the talented 10th, as if there was a top cream of the crop who would be able to kind of govern and be those higher influential professionals in the community, like doctors, lawyers, professors, etc. And he thought that education was a luxury and that it would be above cultural exploration, right? And more so, rather, it fitted the top tier of society to govern the rest of society. And so he was a proponent of education, but just in a different way. His idea of the talented 10th, some people say, is not accurate, as everybody should be able to attain whatever degree of education they would like to. But they both saw education as revolutionary and necessary to move the society forward. So we all know separate is not equal, but back in the day, that's what they tried to say with Brown versus Board of Education as it was approved and the desegregation of schools began. However, some believe that there was a benefit to being taught by our own. So imagine in that day and time, if you are kind of in a cocoon, if you are Black and you are surrounded by Black people, you are protected in a sense from the daily expressions of racism and the daily microaggressions and the daily biases and prejudices and stereotypes. If you're around all Black people, if you're taught by Black teachers, your teacher is not going to think, well, you can't learn because you're Black. This Black teacher is going to say, you must learn this, you must be successful, you are going to do this work, right? And you are in a classroom with all Black kids, and there's a Black teacher, and they believe in you, and it's a positive environment, and there's no bias there about your ability to learn. And then the teacher would expect the best. And psychologically, there have been studies that show when your teacher expects you to do good, the students statistically do perform better, right? Supportive environment was lost after segregation, where Black students were then taught by those of different backgrounds, most of the time whites, who would have challenges believing that Black students could learn as the psychological assumption of the time, which was quote unquote supported by racist scientific studies, was that black students had challenges learning, right? So now all of a sudden you're taught by somebody who might believe you're not able to learn, so they're not going to really try to teach you, right? Also, with blacks being integrated into the school system, it was white flight happened. So the white students would leave the school because the blacks were being bussed in. And so this started to create schools that became more self-segregated and de facto segregation, right? The fact that the whites moved out meant that by default the school would then go back to being segregated in that way. However, the funding for the schools also went down when that happened because of racist people who believed that they didn't need to fund black schools. And so you see an increase in poorly funded schools and underpaid teachers and more the beginning of the detriment of the educational system in our black community. So also with some redlining, which we'll talk about later in the class, and some movements of African American families, even the neighborhoods around the school became black neighborhoods because the white people would leave. So the black people came up from the South trying to find jobs, and so it's really self-segregated the city. And then you had an increase in the inner cities around the school. So it wasn't just the school that started to deteriorate, it was the neighborhood as well, because the white people decided to leave. All right. What are the consequences of the U.S. spending pattern? So the school districts spend nearly 10 times more than the poorest 10%, and spending ratios are 3 to 1 common within states. This means that we do spend money on school districts, but we do not spend money equally. Funding of schools is disproportionate. It is obvious that schools that are heavily funded are the schools where the demographics are mainly white. This is explained by redlining. So, as I was just saying, if a neighborhood saw an influx of blacks coming up from the South to get jobs, their kids had to go to school, their kids would go to those schools now that they were desegregated, and the neighborhood would lose those white families. And so what they would do is they would make or create a new school across the tracks, so to speak. And it would be literally across the railroad tracks. And that's where the white families would go, and that's where their white students would go at that new school. And so the funding moved with those students, and the old, now mostly black, I would say black and maybe poor whites that couldn't afford to move. So the lower class, socioeconomic class families were stuck there. They had less funding, less supplies, less support, less economic income to provide less taxes for the schools. So that's what the government tried to say, that if the people who work in these areas pay their taxes, the taxes fund the school. But we know that the lower income families were the ones who were living around these schools anyways, because the better jobs went to the white families. And so when the people who with better paying jobs moved out of the neighborhood, the taxes for that school and city went down. And so now you have less money to pay qualified teachers. Now you have underfunded, low performing students, et cetera, and that situation has been repeated over and over in many states, unfortunately. And it's unfortunate because there are countries where there are no inner city schools, there are no underfunded schools. Because I watched a documentary that was talking about it, and the lady was saying, why would we ever fund a school differently, fund one school differently than another? I'm like, great question, lady, great question. All right, so correlations of delayed childbearing and education. The book mentions some statistics show that when an African American female delays childbearing, so postpones childbirth till a later date, the likelihood of her going to college increases. Also, if she delays the birth of a second child and has family support, it increases the likelihood that she can finish her education. So that means if African American families support their child going to college, they're more likely to succeed in that venture. However, if no one ever talks to the child about going to college, they're less likely to go to college. It's very interesting. And so the two things that enhance the likelihood of educational attainment are delaying childbirth and delaying the birth of a second child. Here we have some correlations. The first question is looking at single factors that have been linked to increase in future brain cognition. And, not surprisingly, brain cognition and academic achievement have been linked to an earlier start in education. This is why funding for pre-kindergarten was, for a while, was trying to be supported. I forget which administration it was that was trying to get universal funding for pre-K, and it was so that all kids could benefit from an earlier start to education, but it did not get passed as a law, so we do not have it. So what happens is those who can afford pre-K and TK will provide that opportunity to their child, and those who can't will wait until kindergarten to send their kids to school. And so they've missed a couple of critical years to build critical thinking skills, and so that has an effect later on. And research has shown that a higher number of African Americans attend preschool, which could be attributed to having one or even two working parents and the child needing care during the working hours. And a lot of times that would be funded by Crystal Stairs. It's an organization that provides funding for low-income families to provide educational experiences prior to kindergarten. But I will say I have, as somebody who was a preschool teacher, I have been to some of those schools funded by Crystal Stairs, and they are not always the best. The best schools tend to be ones that are paid, that are higher in tuition, and so therefore paid by, the parents in nicer neighborhoods, and that's just the truth of the matter. All right, here. So it's also, we see that we have unequal access to these different schools and educations, as I was just saying. But access to quality preschools for African Americans is one such strategy to help them later in life. Another agency that does provide education early is Head Start, but also some centers may vary in educational quality, as I just mentioned. So for those who can go to a good pre-K, even at a publicly funded Head Start that is a pre-K, that's the best option. The benefits of these centers are listed here. Fewer special education placements, which we know African American children get labeled as needing special education more often than not because of the bias of the people who are assessing them. So greater school achievement can be linked to earlier educational start, lower adult arrest rates, higher income, less likely to be held back, and less of a need to catch up. So teachers are, unfortunately, we're not unbiased. Everybody is biased just a little bit. We are human beings. So humans have flaws, and bias is one of them. Teachers tend to pay less attention to students who they view as troublesome or low achieving, tend to criticize them more, interpret their behavior as bad and interrupt them, maybe not even call on them if their hand is up, give them less attention, provide less feedback, and see them farther away. And students are aware of these differences. I remember my father telling me experiences, well, just like this, all the things on this slide he experienced. So he got really frustrated with school at an early age. And the problem with that is if you get too disconnected from education as a positive experience early on, you tend to fall off and not want to participate. And by, I think it's third or fourth grade, especially for Black boys, if they haven't had a positive experience with education at that point, it's hard to get them back into being involved in school. They've already subconsciously checked out and look at school as useless. So that has been studied, unfortunately. All right, so it's really important to have a teacher that believes in the students, that believes unbiasedly that they all can learn and are there for, the right reason to learn. Because if you do hold a bias or a microaggression as a teacher, it comes out. Biases come out in microaggressions towards the students, and the students they're not dumb. They see this and they know who actually genuinely likes them and who doesn't. All right, so let's see, what is a predictor of the academic achievement of Black youth, more so than simply thinking education is important? For many reasons in the African American community, there is an association made between talking white and being smart, and therefore one cannot be black if you are smart or excited about school and would be an anomaly for an African American kid. So, really, their concrete attitudes regarding how much education matters in their life is one of the main predictors if they're going to be successful. So, this association is seen early on in elementary school and becomes more profound as children grow older. So really early on, that's why it's so important for them to have those positive educational experiences so that they see the value in education and in having good grades, etc. So who is more likely to receive disproportionate disciplinary actions, including expulsions? Well, as we can assume, African American males, their behavior, although it could be the same exact behavior as their white counterpart, gets interpreted as deleterious and needing to be punished or disciplined. So there's what is the connection between having a lack of cultural knowledge among teachers and disciplining students? There is an increase in higher levels of disciplinary action due to cultural conflicts. They assume that the behavior of the child is being insubordinate, even though they are not. And what is the result of this phenomenon? Lower self-esteem. I would say doubt, imposter syndrome, self-confidence is challenged, resilience is lowered, motivation starts to decrease, increases in expressions of anger, depression, and behavioral problems start to occur or could start to occur. Happens more to African American males than African American females, according to studies, and that is so true. I've seen it time and time again. So what are the effects of some of these school policies? One of them was No Child Left Behind. Well, that had negative effects on our African American students because the focus was on testing as opposed to teaching, and it was a redistribution of resources to teach to the test and a narrowing of what was being taught. And so certain tests really are biased in even the way they ask their questions. And unfortunately, these questions tend to affect African Americans a little less equally, I would say, because sometimes, just like IQ testing, there can be biases within the way that questions are asked and even the way that things are taught in the classroom. So teachers were advised to teach to the test, became less motivated to really teach in different modalities that were going to reach students where they were at. So it really promotes an unequal access to education, and it shifted the focus really to focus on these high school exit exams, and it detrimentally affected many kids, especially African American folks, penalizing low socioeconomic schools who had less resources to spend on helping students practice and perform on these standardized tests. So although the intentions were good, it ultimately widened the achievement gap in high school. All right, we have some questions about correlations. So what are the results of ability grouping / tracking? Apparently, African Americans are more likely to be placed on lower tracks. So the upper tracks would be for more successful students, and the lower tracks would be for students who needed more help. And African American students were more likely to be placed on lower tracks. Also, they were more likely to be said that they need to be held back or said to be underperforming, even if they were not. So, according to the textbook, when a school reaches the racial percentage of having over 30%, not even 50%, 30% black students, white people leave. That's when white flight starts to happen. And then when it reaches 80%, whites leave completely. And that is because they are afraid of the quality of the education going down and being exposed to the African Americans. They are wanting more of a white experience, and they're not wanting what they assume to be would be problems with behavior when black students show up at the school. So we know that that's just a negative stereotype, and that's not true. There are plenty of examples where properly funded schools and in properly well-kept neighborhoods, are able to provide opportunities for black students, and they're able to thrive. And really, the idea of the inner city ghetto schools and low-income schools are a function of racism in society, a larger function of it, right? The result of it. And so it goes hand in hand with other issues of like single-parent household who's not able to supervise a child, and then maybe they're getting into trouble in the streets and then therefore that way it snowballs into other things. So it's not just one factor, there's a lot of factors that result into that stereotype of the family who's struggling, single parent in a bad neighborhood, exposure to guns, violence, drugs, etc., dropping out of school. Like the narrative is there, but it is not the entire experience for Black kids. And there's a lot of different factors that contribute to that, and they are all based in systemic racism. All right, special education. Who is more likely to be labeled for having specific learning disabilities? Yes, you can guess it. African Americans. More likely to be seen as disturbing, emotionally disturbed, or having some type of mental retardation, right? Even compared to the same behavior exhibited by their white counterparts. So we know that this is a biased interpretation of behavior. Rates are highest in what part of the nation? In what school districts? We know they're highest in white southern school districts. What is the problem with the role of IQ testing? IQ tests are biased. They are biased and they relate to a portion of factors predicting academic performance and the continued belief that Black children can't learn. That's where the belief came from, biased IQ testing. All right, so here we are talking about GATE, the Gifted and Talented Education Program. So these programs are supposed to allow students to take a test to see if they qualify for the GATE program, where they would be given more opportunities and more rigorous academic coursework. However, taking the exam isn't always the easiest thing. And even in my own experience, the school that I went to, they simply wouldn't test me or my brother, even though my dad asked for it several times. I was between grades, coming from a different school, a Montessori school, to a public school, and my dad wanted to put us in GATE so that we would have the best education, and the school just gave him the runaround. But even GATE tests are biased. They're just another gatekeeper to keep African American and other minority kids out of gifted and talented programming. The test itself lacks multiple modalities and measures that actually test intelligence, and it has been shown to have biases based on IQ results, and also recruited for these programs tend to happen more in affluent neighborhoods to boost numbers. So this is not to say that the GATE program is horrible, but I've heard great things about the GATE program. However, there are still biased, stereotyped, and prejudiced practices that happen regarding who gets to qualify for GATE and whatnot. So, we could look at revamping school policies to teach everyone at a higher level of learning, which correlates with the previous theory mentioned that many times students reach the expectations that you have set for them. So the second point on the slide is that if STEM opportunities are not afforded to African American students, then they might never know what they could have been capable of. And by the time they get to college, if they are interested in STEM, they should have taken remedial, they should have taken proper high school and math courses that they wouldn't have taken. And now they would be left to take remedial science and math. And that means they're spending more time in college unnecessarily, where if they had been identified early on as being a STEM interested student, they could have been put on a path in high school to prepare them for a STEM career. So this disproportionately affects people of color and whatnot. It's really unfortunate. The biased assessments affect them. The biased recruitment affects them. Limited knowledge about the program affects them. The lack of multiple modalities to measure intelligence on tests, and really the programs needing to be more diverse in delivery of material to continuously relevantly engage students and people from all cultures, right? If we're going to give opportunities for gifted kids, we should give them all the opportunities we can, right? So here we see that there's peer influence. And the important thing here is that at the age, in school age kids, friends are so important. So if your friends aren't into school, then you might tend to not be into school as well. And we see the fourth grade failure syndrome, referring to a bias in school, cultural sensitivity, and disproportionately harsh discipline. This is going to lower teacher expectations and then start tracking Black students into special education or remedial classes, which really has a cumulative effect of diminishing Black students' enthusiasm and motivation for school. And this happens by fourth grade, okay? So studies have found that culture plays a large role in the classroom, and African Americans might perform better when classroom is set up more collectivistic environment, where they are active participants, where they are valued as equal members of this educational community, as opposed to more traditional Eurocentric approaches where the teacher teaches, the student is supposed to be quiet and sit and learn, and the teacher is seen as an authority figure in the classroom. By fourth grade, I think that especially our African American males, they recognize authority figures as a point of contention, and so that could possibly be one of the reasons why they are not responding positively to a teacher who they believe probably doesn't think that they are going to go anywhere in life anyways. And unfortunately, teachers will say that to students. It's really sad. So those are just some of the things that are affecting poor performance in kids who might otherwise be very well, just need a little opportunity to engage positively in school to perform well. So culturally responsive teaching is popular lately in the news and whatnot. We see some examples of that where the teacher's pedagogical style, pedagogy means teaching style, so their teaching style, it really resonates with their students, and the students are all, clapping and singing along to things to help them with math and remember facts and figures, and it relates to more of a cultural experience that the students respond well to because it's familiar to them. Things in the Black culture of like the call and response is familiar to us. Things that are about being physically involved, like when you have to stand up and clap and move around, are more things that we respond to better than sitting still and being quiet and having to just listen, right? So there are things that culturally responsive teaching highlights, really having positive experiences with the family because it is a collectivistic experience, this educational experiences, and communicating of high expectations, saying they can learn, saying that they're smart, right? Learning within the context of their culture, right? What I just mentioned about maybe using more songs and rhythms to teach, maybe using kinesthetic movements, which is moving about while you're learning, right? Student-centered instruction, meaning having the students involved in the instruction process. Culturally mediated instruction, reshaping the curriculum to be relevant and to include Black students in the curriculum so they see themselves, and the teacher is a facilitator as opposed to the one making students follow the rules. That would be a good shift as well. Improving educational outcomes looks at what research says, developing school programs to foster development of children in a more well-rounded and culturally relevant way would improve African American students' performance. So this would be to help parents become more involved in their PTA. I would say looking at the school and the child to develop all 6 areas of their developmental domains, as it says on the slide, and the staff really learning about different ways they can communicate belief and cultural understanding with the students in a non-threatening way and not be seen as proponents of authority. In the page in Canvas, there is this excerpt from Michelle Obama's book as it talks about the workforce. So you want to consider the time in which Blacks were trying to get employment and were having difficulty doing that. Her father is one of those people. It's a very fascinating story, and it's a story of a lot of Black people in that day and age who were very smart but could not get any work outside of manual labor or low-paying jobs, and the frustration they must have felt knowing that they were smarter, but because of society's setup, they were not allowed advanced jobs, and that has affected her father, and she talks about that in her book. So I hope you listen to that. I have it typed out, and you can also listen to it. I think it's quite fascinating. So let's look at the workforce for a moment here. There have been inequalities in the workforce. This slide lists some of those. A lot of glass ceilings or double standards. For women, they have the dual whammy, I guess, the more complexities of being Black and a woman, so more intersections there. So even if they were to get a job, it might be lower paying than the one that the male might get. When you look at opportunities for advancements, a lot of times black people are overlooked on the job, and someone younger with less experience or less of a degree will get the promotion. There's also glass ceilings. You can only go so high in certain fields. Certain jobs, especially back in the day, used to be able to see that supervisors were white and all the people under them were black and or people of color, etc. And it was so evident to see that management was all white. And so that's what that glass ceiling is talking about. So, and wanting to be in a professional career, but still having such a difficult time getting through the process, and navigate those waters, it just provided a lot of barriers for the workforce. Also, back in the day, you could be a factory worker. Like, for example, in Northern California, there was a Ford plant, and the black workers came to work at the plant. It was difficult to find housing in the area because the neighborhood around the area of the factory was segregated. And then it was also difficult to maintain your job as soon as the people from the war came back to get their job back because they had gone and fought for in the World War. Then, or another, I forget which war it was. I don't want to say the wrong thing. But they came back from war, and the black people lost their job because the white people came back to get their job, right? And so the black people were not allowed to unionize. Unionizing is important because if you all get together and you all bargain for better wages, bargain for better health care, bargain for better benefits, bargain for better schedules and workers' rights, you are more powerful. Well, employers, they would just fire you if you were black back in the day and you tried to unionize. So there's plenty of frustrations with the workforce being a racist place. And some African Americans tried to navigate around that by joining the military, which meant you had more African Americans in the military from low-income families, fighting wars that they didn't agree with, hence Vietnam, etc. And so work really was connected to the social stipulations of the day and the social beliefs of the day. So as social beliefs changed, after civil rights increased, you saw hopefully more equal rights, but a lot of times things change on paper and they take longer to change in actuality. So even to this day, sometimes we'll see or hear of workplace violations of civil rights of black people. The imposter syndrome is something that happens. It is more pronounced for African American women, but it is when you feel inferior or that you have to prove your self-worth in the workplace and work twice as hard to get half as much. And it's imposter syndrome, and it's there because there's this double sense or double standard that you were hired, although you were black. There's this question of if you're smart enough, if you're good enough, if you were just hired because they needed to hire one black person to not seem racist, right? So imposter syndrome is, in a sense, you just worry that someone is going to look at you as unqualified, or that you must have been a diversity hire, or that you or your work is somehow less than, although you hold the same degrees or more, the same work experience or more, and you do the same duties and responsibilities. You earned your position fair and square, but there still tends to be in the back of your mind that you have to watch yourself on the job and make sure that nobody can say you're lazy or nobody can say you didn't do your job right. And this imposter syndrome has effects on your mental stress, your emotional stress, and as we'll learn later in this class, those things have effect on your physical body and disease conditions as well. The stress of the imposter syndrome, the stress of long-term exposures to racism have these detrimental effects on the body. So we're going to continue talking about that later. I hope you guys enjoyed the lecture.